My name is Tessa, and I was 16 years old when my mother dropped me off at a Greyhound station in the middle of January with a duffel bag and $40 in cash, told me to figure it out, and drove away without looking back. I know how that sounds. I know people hear stories like that and think there must be more to it. Some context, some explanation, some version where the parent had a reason that made a little bit of sense. I used to think the same thing. I spent years trying to find that explanation. I don't anymore. But to understand what happened that Tuesday morning in January, you have to understand what the 3 years before it looked like. My parents split when I was 12. It wasn't dramatic, at least not the way I thought divorce was supposed to be. There was no screaming, no plates thrown, no police called. My father just came home one evening, sat down across from my mother at the kitchen table while I pretended to do homework in the next room, and said he couldn't do it anymore. 2 weeks later, he was living in a one-bedroom apartment across town, and our house felt like a museum, everything exactly where it had always been. Except the person who used to fill it up was gone. My father and I stayed close. He coached my soccer team for 2 seasons after the divorce, showed up to every single game even when my mother made scheduling it deliberately difficult. He called every Sunday night. When I had nightmares, which I did for a long time after, I could call him and he'd pick up no matter what time it was. He wasn't perfect. He worked too much, forgot birthdays sometimes, had a temper he was still learning to manage. But he was mine, and I was his, and I never once doubted that. My mother, on the other hand, was someone I was still figuring out. She'd been fine when I was younger. Warm even in her way. She took me to museums on weekends, taught me how to bake her grandmother's apple cake, checked my homework every night with a red pen. But after the divorce, something shifted in her that I couldn't name at 12 and can barely name now. She got quieter, sharper. She'd look at me sometimes with this expression I couldn't read, like I was a puzzle she hadn't agreed to solve. About 18 months after my parents split, she started dating someone. His name was Philip. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who laughed too loud at his own jokes and expected the room to laugh with him. He sold commercial real estate and drove a car that was too expensive for the neighborhood we lived in. He had 2 kids from his previous marriage, a boy named Troy who was 14, and a girl named Cassidy who was 10. They came on weekends at first, then more and more often, until by the time my mother announced she and Philip were getting married, they were at our house almost as much as I was. I want to be fair. I tried with Troy and Cassidy, I did. Troy was mostly indifferent to me, which was honestly easier to deal with than hostility. Cassidy was sweet, actually. She liked to draw horses, and she'd sometimes knock on my bedroom door and ask if I wanted to watch a movie. And I always said yes because she was 10 years old and none of this was her fault. Philip was the problem. Not because he was cruel exactly. He was more subtle than that. He had this way of making me feel like a guest in my own home. Not in words. He was always careful with words, but in glances, and the slight pause before he included me in plans, in the way he'd say, "our family," in a way that never quite seemed to include me in the count. My mother didn't correct him. That was the part that stayed with me. They got married in September, 14 months after they started dating. Small ceremony, just family and close friends. I was a bridesmaid. I stood at the altar in a dusty blue dress that Cassidy had picked out, and I smiled in every photograph, and nobody knew that 2 nights before the wedding I'd cried in my car for an hour because I couldn't figure out who I was supposed to be in this new configuration. Things were okay for a while after that. Not good, but okay. The kind of okay where you keep your head down and count the days until college and try not to need too much from anyone. Then my mother got pregnant. She told me on a Thursday evening in March, right before dinner. She was glowing. I remember that. The way she was actually glowing in a way I hadn't seen on her face in years. She said she and Philip were having a baby, that it was a girl, that they were thrilled. I said congratulations and meant it. I did. She deserved to be happy. I just wasn't prepared for what came next. The baby changed everything. It was like watching a tide go out. The attention, the energy, the basic daily acknowledgement that I existed, it all slowly receded. I told myself it made sense. She was 41, pregnant, tired. A baby takes everything. I did the dishes without being asked. I kept my room clean. I made myself small and useful and undemanding. I thought if I just needed less, everything would be fine. But the less I needed, the less she seemed to notice me at all. By the following January, I was 16, a junior in high school. I had a 4.1 GPA, a spot on the varsity soccer team, and a guidance counselor who kept talking about scholarship potential. I had a father who called every Sunday, and a best friend named Jules who sat with me at lunch and talked me through the worst days. On the surface, I was fine. On the inside, I was disappearing. The morning everything changed started, like most mornings that winter. I got up early, made my own breakfast, packed my own lunch. My mother was in the kitchen feeding the baby, Nadia, 4 months old by then, and Philip was somewhere in the back of the house. I said good morning. My mother said good morning back without looking up. I went to school, I came home, and my mother was sitting at the kitchen table waiting for me, which she almost never did anymore. And something about the way she was sitting made my stomach drop before she even opened her mouth. She didn't ease into it. I'll give her that, at least. She didn't pretend. She said she and Philip had been talking. She said the house felt crowded. That with Nadia here and Troy and Cassidy spending more and more time with them, the space just wasn't working. She said she'd called my father and that I was going to go stay with him for a while. Then she slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a printed Greyhound schedule. My father lived 4 hours away by then. He'd taken a job in another city the previous spring. I stared at that paper for a long time. I said, "What do you mean for a while?" She said, "We'll figure out the details later." I said, "I have school here. I have soccer season. I have a 4.1 GPA and a counselor who thinks I can get into a really good school, and you want me to just leave?" She said, "Your father's city has good schools." I said, "Did he agree to this?" She didn't answer that directly. She said the ticket was for Thursday, 2 days away. She said I could take whatever I could fit in the big duffel bag and the rest she'd ship later. I went to my room and I sat on my floor and I did not cry. I think I was too stunned to cry. I just sat there, on the floor next to my bed, and I thought about how a person could grow inside someone's body, come into the world through them, live in their house for 16 years, and still become optional. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and I went back and forth 100 times between anger and grief and something that didn't have a name yet. I thought about calling my father. I stopped myself because part of me was afraid that if I called him first, if I warned him, I'd hear something in his voice. Confusion, hesitation, the sound of a man being asked to take on something he hadn't prepared for. I wasn't sure I could survive that on top of everything else. Thursday came. My mother drove me to the Greyhound station in the morning before the baby woke up. We barely spoke. She carried nothing. I carried my own bag to the curb. She opened her purse and counted out $40 and put it in my hand, and she said the ride was about 4 hours, and to text her when I got there. I looked at her. I looked at this woman who had taught me to bake apple cake and checked my homework with a red pen, and had once, when I was 7 and terrified of a thunderstorm, held me all night in her bed and told me I was safe. I said, "Are you going to miss me?" She said, "Tessa, don't make this harder than it needs to be." She got back in the car. She drove away. I did not watch her until she was out of sight because I didn't want that to be the last image I held of her. My mother's taillights disappearing around a corner, leaving me standing on a curb with $40 and a duffel bag and the January cold coming through my coat. I bought a ticket. I sat down on a plastic chair near the window. I had my phone, which was at 63% battery. I had a water bottle and a granola bar and the $40 and my duffel bag. I had a father who may or may not be expecting me. I called him. He picked up on the second ring, the way he always did. I said, "Dad, Mom put me on a Greyhound. I'm at the station. I'm coming." There was a pause. Not a long pause, maybe 3 seconds. But I lived several years inside those 3 seconds. Then he said, "Stay right where you are. Do not get on that bus. I'm coming to get you." I said, "It's 4 hours, Dad. You don't have to." He said, "Tessa, stay where you are. I'll be there." He hung up. I sat back in that plastic chair and I felt something in my chest loosen, just slightly, the way a fist unclenches in water. He was there in 3 hours and 40 minutes. He'd broken traffic laws to do it. He walked in the door of that Greyhound station in his work coat with his tie still on and his hair slightly out of place, and he crossed the floor in about 6 strides and he hugged me so hard my feet came off the ground. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just held on. Then he pulled back and looked at my face and said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I don't think so." He said, "Okay. That's a fair answer. Let's go." He'd already called his office on the drive down, rearranged his week. He'd already, I would learn later, spoken to a family attorney friend of his just to understand his options, he said. Though the word options made me realize he'd been preparing for something to break down for longer than I knew. We drove back to his city. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment by then, clean and practical, with a real guest room that had a window that looked out onto a small courtyard with a tree. He showed me to it like he was showing me to something he'd been saving. There were fresh towels on the chair. He'd stopped at a pharmacy on the drive back and bought shampoo and conditioner and a toothbrush just in case I'd forgotten mine. I had forgotten mine. I hadn't been thinking clearly when I packed. That night we ate takeout at his kitchen table and he asked me questions. Careful, steady questions, the kind that opened doors without pushing me through them. What did I need? What did school look like? Did I want him to call the school here, get the enrollment started? Did I want to talk about what had happened, or did I want to just eat lo mein and watch a movie? I said both. So we talked. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which was harder for him than it looked. I could see him working to keep his face steady when I got to the part about the Greyhound schedule, the $40, don't make this harder than it needs to be. His jaw tightened. His hands, folded on the table, pressed together until his knuckles went briefly white. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This is not your fault. Not a single part of it." I said, "I know," and I did know, intellectually. But knowing something in your head and feeling it in your body are two completely different things, and my body was still working on it. He said, "You're going to finish high school here. I'm going to be at every single game. And if you want to go back there at any point, to see Jules, to get the rest of your stuff, for any reason, you tell me and we'll make it happen." I nodded. I looked down at my lo mein. I said, "She didn't even look back, Dad." He didn't try to explain it away. He didn't say, "I'm sure she loves you," or "she's probably struggling," or any of the things people say when they're trying to make pain smaller than it is. He just said, "I know." That was the right answer. The next weeks were strange in the way that big transitions are always strange, full of logistics that distract you from the grief until you're alone at night, and the grief finds you anyway. I enrolled in a new high school. The credits transferred cleanly because I was a good student, and good students, at least, are portable. I joined the soccer team mid-season, which was uncomfortable for about 2 weeks until it wasn't. My new coach put me on the field in the second game and I played like I had something to prove, which I did. And after the game, a girl named Ren, who played center mid, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You've got some speed on you," and we've been friends ever since. My mother called 3 times in the first month. Texts, mostly checking in, she called it. She asked how school was going. She did not apologize. She did not explain. She talked about Nadia learning to smile, which I did want to know about because Nadia was innocent in all of this and I loved her in spite of everything. I texted back with short answers. I kept the door open a crack because my father, to his credit, said the choice was mine and he'd support whatever I decided. But he also said, quietly, that burning bridges was permanent, and I was 16, and it was worth thinking carefully. About 2 months after I arrived at my father's apartment, I was unpacking the last box of things he'd arranged to have shipped. My mother had actually sent them, which surprised me, and at the bottom of the box, underneath my yearbooks and my old cleats, I found a folded envelope I didn't recognize. It was addressed to my mother. The return address was a law office. The date on the postmark was 6 months earlier. I shouldn't have opened it. I know that, but I did. It was a letter from my father's attorney, or rather, a response to a letter my father had sent. It documented a series of requests my father had made over the prior year. requests to increase his parenting time, requests for mediation, a formal inquiry into my living situation filed after he'd spoken to my guidance counselor, the same counselor who kept talking about my scholarship potential, who had apparently also been concerned enough to reach out to my father herself. My mother had never told me any of this. My father had been trying to get me for a year. I sat on my bedroom floor for a long time with that letter in my hands. I thought about all the Sunday phone calls where I'd edited myself, kept things light, not wanting to worry him. I thought about the mornings I'd made my own breakfast and told myself I was being mature. I thought about my mother's face at the kitchen table, sliding that Greyhound schedule across to me like she was returning a library book. He hadn't given up on me. He'd been fighting, quietly, in the background, in the language of legal letters and formal requests, while I'd been shrinking myself to fit into a house that no longer had room for me. I went and found my father in the living room. I handed him the letter. I watched his face as he read it. Not surprise, but something more complicated. The expression of a person who has carried something heavy for a long time and has just been seen doing it. He looked up. He said, "I didn't want to put you in the middle." I said, "I know." I said, "Thank you." He nodded. He folded the letter and put it on the table between us, and we sat there for a while in the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. My father had a friend, a woman named Dr. Aldridge, a family therapist who had an opening on Thursday afternoons. He mentioned her once without pressure, said she was good if I ever wanted to talk to someone who wasn't him. I made the appointment myself, which felt important, walking into that office for the first time, sitting down across from a stranger and saying my mother put me on a Greyhound and drove away and I'm trying to figure out what to do with that. That was one of the harder things I've done, but it was also the beginning of actually processing it, rather than just surviving it. Dr. Aldridge asked me in our second session what I was most afraid of. I thought about it. I said, "I'm afraid that what happened means something is wrong with me, that I was too much or not enough, or both at the same time." She said, "And what do you think actually happened?" I said, "I think my mother made a choice about her new life, and I didn't fit into it, and instead of doing the hard work of figuring out how to make me fit, she took the exit." She asked how it felt to say that out loud. I said, "Like swallowing glass. And also like putting something down that I've been carrying for a long time. That's grief, I think. It's both things at once. It doesn't resolve into one clean feeling. It stays complicated. My mother and I talk occasionally now. It has been almost 9 years since that January morning. I finished high school at the top of my class. Not valedictorian, but close. Close enough that I got up at graduation and gave a speech about resilience that I'd written sitting at my father's kitchen table at 2 in the morning. My father sat in the third row in a tie he'd bought specifically for the occasion, and he cried, which he would deny later but which I saw clearly. I got a partial scholarship to a university 3 hours from my father's city. I studied psychology, which was not a coincidence. I have a career now and an apartment with good light and a therapist I still see every few weeks, and friends who know the full story and love me anyway. Nadia is 8. She is a hurricane of energy and curiosity, and she video calls me sometimes just to show me things she's found. A bug, a drawing, a book she likes. I love her completely. She is the innocent part of all of this, and I refuse to let what happened between me and my mother touch what I have with her. Philip and I have a polite, distant relationship. He sends Christmas cards. I send them back. My mother has apologized twice. Not in the way I'd spent years hoping for. Not a reckoning, not a full accounting. But in the sideways, partial way of someone who can acknowledge that something went wrong without fully sitting with what they did. The first apology came 2 years after the Greyhound station, in a phone call that lasted 40 minutes. The second came in a letter when I graduated. I received both of them. I thanked her for them. I did not tell her they were enough because they weren't, exactly. But I also did not tell her they meant nothing because they didn't, exactly. I chose to leave the door open. Not wide, not the door of my childhood, which is gone, but a door. A reasonable door. I made that choice for myself, not for her. My father remarried 3 years ago. His wife's name is Fern, and she is warm and steady and makes extremely good chili and has never once tried to be my mother, which is exactly right. We get along easily, the way you do with someone who has no agenda other than to coexist kindly. I think about that 16-year-old girl at the Greyhound station sometimes, sitting in the plastic chair with 63% battery and $40 in a duffel bag. She didn't know that morning that she was 4 hours away from the beginning of something real. A life built on solid ground with a parent who showed up, in a city that would come to feel genuinely like home. She didn't know any of that yet. She just knew she was cold and scared and that she had a father who picked up on the second ring. That was enough to start with. That turned out to be more than enough. If you're sitting somewhere right now feeling like you've been made optional, like someone looked at the life they were building and quietly edited you out of the plans, I want you to hear this. That is about them. That is entirely, completely, irreversibly about them. It says something about their capacity, their fear, their limitations. It says nothing permanent about your worth. The people who are supposed to love you unconditionally don't always manage to. That is one of the harder truths of being alive. And there is no clean way through it, but there is a way through. And sometimes the person on the other end of the phone, the one who picks up on the second ring and says, "Stay right where you are, I'm coming to get you." Sometimes that person is already in your life, waiting for you to call. Call them. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that January morning. Not in a dramatic way, just in the quiet, ordinary way you start to notice patterns when you've had enough time and enough therapy to actually look at them clearly. My mother made a series of choices. Small ones at first. The choice not to correct Philip when he said "our family" and the count came up short. The choice to stop asking how soccer practice went. The choice to slide a Greyhound schedule across a kitchen table instead of sitting down and doing the harder, messier work of figuring out how to keep our family intact through yet another change. Each of those choices was small on its own. Together they built something. A door, slowly closing until the morning she drove away and it shut behind her. And my father made choices too. The choice to pick up on the second ring. The choice to get in the car. The choice to spend a year filing legal letters quietly, without telling me, because he didn't want me to feel like a prize in a custody dispute. He could have given up. He could have decided the distance was too complicated, the situation too messy, that he'd tried and it hadn't worked. He didn't. He kept showing up in whatever way he had access to, and when I finally called him from that plastic chair with 63% battery, he was ready. I don't think what happened to me was random. I think the life I have now, the stability, the good friendships, the career that actually means something to me, is a direct result of choices, mine and my father's both. It's not that I earned it by suffering. Suffering alone doesn't produce anything but more suffering. It's that when I was given the choice between shrinking and reaching out, I reached. When my father was given the choice between protecting himself from inconvenience and showing up for his kid, he showed up. Those choices compounded over years into something real. That's the thing nobody tells you when you're 16 and sitting on a cold plastic chair, wondering if you matter. Integrity is not what you perform when people are watching. It's what you do when the situation is inconvenient and uncomfortable and nobody is keeping score. My father's integrity, quiet, undramatic, consistent, was what I was building my life on before I even knew it was there. And my mother's absence of it, in those small accumulated moments, was what eventually made the structure of our relationship too unstable to hold. I'm not saying this to condemn her. I've done enough work in enough therapy rooms to understand that people hurt their children, not usually from malice, but from limitation, from their own unhealed wounds, their own fear, their own failure to grow into something bigger than what was done to them. Understanding that doesn't erase what happened, but it does mean I can hold what happened without letting it define me. What I know now, at 31, that I didn't know at 16, resilience is not a personality trait you're born with or without. It's a practice. It's the decision, made over and over, to keep building even when something has been torn down. Tessa at 16 didn't feel resilient. She felt scared and cold and like she'd been quietly erased. But she made one phone call. And that one call was enough to change the entire trajectory. You don't need to have everything figured out. You just need to make the next right move. One call. One honest conversation. One decision to reach toward the person who has actually shown up for you, instead of waiting for the one who hasn't to finally come around. That's the whole story, really. The rest is just everything that grew from it.